Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar about Maine's sea-run fish species and success stories from right here in Maine. I hope that you and your families are safe and healthy during this COVID-19 crisis. We would love to be with you in person today, but we appreciate you joining remotely via Zoom today. My name is Todd Martin. I'm the Grassroots Outreach Coordinator at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. I'm zooming in today from Winslow, which is nestled right between the Sebasticook and the Kennebec rivers, which you'll hear a lot about today, and the success of fish returning to those rivers. And you'll learn a lot about the phenomena of Maine sea-run fish species. But first, a bit about NRCM. So the Natural Resources Council of Maine is a nonprofit membership organization protecting, restoring, and conserving Maine's environment now and for future generations. For more than 60 years, the Natural Resources Council of Maine has been protecting the places and the way of life that make Maine so special. NRCM harnesses the power of the law, science, and the voices of more than 25,000 supporters statewide and beyond. Before we get to our presentation, just a few notes about the Zoom technology that we're using today. So first, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on YouTube in the coming days. Your video and your audio has been disabled for today's program by design. You'll only be able to see and hear our presenters. If you have a question for either Nick or Deb, you can use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen on the ribbon. So use the Q&A box if you have questions or comments. We are going to show a few short videos today as part of the presentation. And the sound may play back a little bit loud on your computer. So before we play those videos, we're going to give you a heads up in case you want to adjust your volume down just a little bit. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'll kick it over to Deb Wilson to introduce herself. Take it away, Deb.
Thank you, Todd. And my name is Deb Wilson. I'm here today as the director of the Damariscotta Mills Fish Ladder Restoration. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of that project with you.
And I'm Nick Bennett. I'm the staff scientist for the Natural Resources Council of Maine. I've been here for about 23 years and have been working on restoring Maine sea-run fish since I started. And I'm going to speak first. So Abin, if we could have the slideshow, that would be great. Super. So when I think about sea-run fish, in addition to the fact that the fish are cool and I like watching them, and some of them I really like to catch, I also think about the broader connections that they have with the rest of our ecosystem, the connections they have with each other, the connections that they have with people. And I also think, unfortunately, about the disconnections. The connections that are no longer there, the breaks we've put into what should be links between our lakes and our oceans that no longer exist because of obstructions. And you really can't look at the issues for sea-run fish in Maine without also looking at their, I think, impacts that structures and people have had on their populations. Next slide. Thank you. So it's pretty easy to fall in love with sea-run fish. They are amazing fish. This is one of the most amazing. It's an Atlantic sturgeon. Next slide. And click on that. That is probably a short-nosed sturgeon in the Kennebec, although it could be a small Atlantic sturgeon. I'd like to think that he's celebrating some of our restoration successes that we've had on the Kennebec River. Next slide. This is another of my favorite sea-run fish creatures. It's an American shad. They are ferocious fighters, although they are filter feeders like their cousins, the alewives. But they are absolutely a wonderful sport fishing species that most Mainers don't know about. I've been shad fishing and caught shad in front of people who say, "What's that? What kind of fish is that?" And it just shows you that we've lost our connection to these species, which used to be so important for our ability to feed ourselves in Maine. And happily, the shad is one of the species that's making a comeback now, although it's still in very, very small numbers compared to historic levels. And there are quite good recreational fisheries for shad on the Kennebec and getting better on the Penobscot. Next slide. Sea run fish come in all sizes. These are actually Atlantic salmon. They're Atlantic salmon par, which is a name for the salmon when it's young and living in freshwater. Salmon are also a spectacular species. They're critically endangered in the United States, and Maine is the last hope for saving these fish. Next slide. As I said, sea run fish are creatures great and small. These are elvers, which are baby eels. They are returning from the Sargasso Sea, where they're born. Nobody's actually ever seen eels spawning, but we know they spawn in the vicinity of the Sargasso Sea, and then the eggs and larval eels make their way on ocean currents back to the east coast of the US, and as they become able to swim, they head up our estuaries and rivers. This is a group of baby eels. They clump together like this in sometimes what are called balls, and they'll, at opportune times, all move upstream together in these groups. It's really amazing that these tiny fish can make their way all the way from the ocean to back to fresh water, where some of them will live for many decades. They're the only species of sea run fish in Maine that are actually born in the ocean and come back to fresh water to live. Most of the other, all of the other species in Maine do the opposite. Next slide. So as I said, sea run fish are a story of connections. Alewives are a really good example of this. Alewives feed just about everything that will eat fish. This is an osprey actually holding on to 3 fish, 3 alewives. Just something I've never seen, but Linwood Riggs, who took this photo and is an awesome photographer, is very patient, and he spent many, many, many hours on the Kennebec taking pictures of ospreys to be able to get this spectacular one. As alewives have come back in some places in Maine, we have seen a really big increase in predatory bird species. Next slide. These are eagles chilling out along the banks of the Sebasticook River, which is now home to the largest alewife run in the world. And it's also home to the largest concentrations of bald eagles east of the Mississippi. They group there during the alewife run in the spring and have an easy time getting their fill and feeding their babies in the, from alewives swimming up the Sebasticook River towards Sebasticook Lake to spawn. Next slide. This is also on the Sebasticook near the Benton Falls Dam. And these are people who are reconnecting themselves with connections that we largely have lost. Again, a couple hundred years ago, and for many millennia before that, before Europeans came here, all people in Maine had connections to these fish, and they were critical food sources for us to survive. This gentleman is catching fish mostly to be used for lobster bait, and you can see he's catching a lot of them. Sea run fish have made a very good comeback, again, on the Sebasticook River. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide. I just want to show you one more star of the sea run fish world for me. We're getting there. Here it is. That's a sea lamprey. And this is a video that's taken from the inside the fish sorting facility at the Milford Dam on the Penobscot. Sea lampreys don't get a lot of love, which is unfortunate. Like all of the sea run species, they're a miracle of biology. They spend their lives basically buried in the mud in lakes, and they undergo a phenomenal transformation that allows them to swim from freshwater into saltwater, and they grow a mouth with a teeth in it that allows them to attach to other fish, and they make their living preying on other fish that way. But that's only for a short period of their lives when they've gotten out to sea. They get a bad rap for this because unfortunately they are invasive in the Great Lakes and have caused some trouble there. They don't belong in the Great Lakes. They're native to the East Coast. This is where they should be. Another key ecological role of the lamprey is that they make perfect places for Atlantic salmon to lay their eggs. Atlantic salmon really like to use old lamprey nests to lay their eggs. And it's not likely that we can restore Atlantic salmon without also restoring all of the other sea run fish. Alewives provide them with cover so that they aren't eaten by birds and other predators. If you just have salmon in a river, forget it. The salmon are not in sufficient numbers to be able to survive the predation. So they need the cover species, and they need the lampreys to help them be more successful at nesting. So there's a role for sea run fish, even if they don't look terribly inviting. Next slide. So here, unfortunately, is a slide about disconnection. All of those blue dots are dams in Maine. Almost none of those dams generate power. We have well over 1,000 dams in Maine, out of which about 100 to 120 generate power. We get more than half that power from only 9 of those dams. So a lot of the obstructions to sea run fish in Maine are dams that don't generate power, and then of the ones that do generate power, really only a small number of them generate a large amount of power each. So this gives you a sense of how difficult it is to be a sea run fish, because if you're a sea run fish, you want to get by these dams, and it's pretty hard to do. Most of them don't have fish passage. A lot of the dams in Maine are lake outlet dams. We probably have 70 to 80% of our lakes augmented with dams, so that we have nice, stable shorefronts and places you can put docks and boats. The unintended consequence of all that is we block fish from places that they need to get to spawn. The next slide, in some ways, is even scarier. Next slide. This looks like a diagram that you see at your eye doctor's office to test whether or not you're colorblind, but it isn't. It's a map of road crossings where roads cross streams. You can just see here, this is Bangor, and this is Augusta down here. So this is just a small chunk of Maine. This is Penobscot Bay. And the red ones are road crossings that fish can't get by. So just in your mind, superimpose this picture on the previous picture. And again, you see how difficult it is for fish that used to range all the way from the oceans up to the western mountains and northern Maine. These fish are having a pretty hard time of it now, and that's why sea run fish as a whole are probably at about, somewhere between 1% and 5% of historic levels. Next slide. So removing obstacles to sea run fish is the most important thing we can do to restore them. It's a slow process, and it happens one obstacle at a time. The Fort Halifax Dam blocked the mouth of the Sebasticook River, which is the Kennebec largest tributary, and it blocked the best spawning habitat in that system for alewives for well over 100 years. It was a huge fight to get this dam out, even though the owner of the dam wanted to remove it because it generated so little power that it was a money loser to keep up. Next slide. This is a picture of the first day of the dam owner's equipment removing the Fort Halifax Dam. The people standing behind the dam are not there happy about this situation. They were actually yelling insults at the driver of the backhoe, or ramhoe, I guess we would call it. This was a terrible fight getting this dam out. It was very ugly, very hard. We had to fight 3 different lawsuits, 2 in state court and 1 in federal court, against groups made up in part of some of the people behind the dam in this picture. We also had to kill about 6 bills in the legislature that would have banned dam removals in Maine entirely, just to keep this dam in. And, you know, people wanted their lakefront property and were willing to look the other way in terms of the damage that this dam was doing. Not to mention the fact that the dam owner who owned the dam wanted the dam out, and that was the owner's right to take it out. Next slide. This is the mouth of the Sebasticook River with the dam removed. Next slide. This is a chart that shows how dramatic the alewife recovery was after the removal of the Fort Halifax Dam. So the first arrow is when Edwards Dam was removed. And you can see that alewives are starting, the bars, the red bars are alewives. You can see that alewives start to recover after the removal of Edwards Dam in 1999, but you don't see the population of alewives really start to surge until after the Fort Halifax Dam removal. And that's because Fort Halifax blocked access to Sebasticook Lake, which is where the bulk of the alewife spawning in this system is happening right now. There were fish lifts put in at the Benton Falls Dam and at the Burnham Dam, and another fishway put in at the mouth of Sebasticook Lake prior to the full restoration of alewives. And you can see once Fort Halifax came out, the alewife population just exploded. And alewives are the easiest of the sea-run fish to restore. If you get stuff out of their way, they come back. Next slide. So this is a map that shows the various basins in Maine and which basins have, and the alewife potential of various basins. And you can see from this map, it's a little hard to read maybe, that the St. Croix River by far has the biggest alewife potential, about 22 million alewives, which is nearly twice the next biggest river, which is the Penobscot at 14 million alewives. So the St. Croix is really important. Nevertheless, the St. Croix has been the site of some of the worst of the battles over restoring sea-run fish. Next slide. This slide shows a chart from 1987 to 2008. And you can see that in 1987, there were a whole bunch of alewives in the St. Croix River, more than 2 million. Much like with other rivers in Maine, the St. Croix was dammed up and polluted beyond almost all hope of redemption. But with the Clean Water Act and a lot of federal funding for fish passage, things started to get better in the 60s and 70s. And by the end of the 80s, because of that investment in fish passage by the federal government, the alewife population that had been extirpated was really starting to roll. It was starting to explode. Unfortunately, in the late 80s, there was also a series of drought summers. And during those summers, in Spednick Lake, which is at the top of the St. Croix system, there were, the water levels were naturally low, and then there were some really hard drawdowns by the company that owned power generating dams below Spednick Lake, which is a storage lake. And so the lake shore was exposed for several summers running. And what happened because of that is that smallmouth bass, which are an introduced species, they were introduced in the mid 1800s to this area. Smallmouth bass, which lay their lakes, which lay their eggs on the shore, near the shores of lakes, their nests were exposed to the sun for several summers running. And so essentially all of those eggs died. And that resulted in a crash in the smallmouth bass population. A lot of guides in this area made their living from people coming to catch smallmouth bass. So this was a hardship for them. And they saw at the same time that alewife populations were increasing in the St. Croix. And they made the very unfortunate link that the crash in the bass population was due to the increase in alewives, which simply isn't true. And they started a movement and they succeeded in talking the Canadian government into closing the fishway into Spednick Lake. They talked the US Fish and Wildlife Service into closing fish lifts fishways that it had jurisdiction over. And eventually they talked the Maine legislature in 1995 into passing a law to block all alewives from the St. Croix. And they were incredibly successful. By 2008, a run of nearly 3 million fish turned into a run of less than 1,000 fish. And this was done with no scientific backing. It had serious impacts on predator species, ospreys and eagles. Numbers decreased drastically in this region during the blocking of alewives, and it was based on really crazy thinking that alewives were harming smallmouth bass. Nothing could be farther than the truth. Smallmouth bass love to eat alewives like everything else. NRCM tried to get this terrible state law repealed for many years. It took, God, when did we start working on this? Late 90s. It took about 15 years before we finally got the state legislature to reverse this terrible law in 2013. And much like after the removal of Fort Halifax Dam, when the law blocking the fishways on the St. Croix passed and those fishways were open, even though they're in really bad shape right now and need work, the alewives exploded. They came back like gangbusters. Next slide. And so remember, this St. Croix alewife run was at almost less than 1,000 fish in 2008. This year, Abin, is there any way to zoom in on the lower part of this chart? A little more? So thank you. So you can see at the Milltown Dam where they count alewives, there already have been 500,000 alewives that have passed there. So in the last 7 years, the run has gone from a few thousand fish to 500,000 fish, and it'll keep growing. And all the creatures who love alewives eat them, like to watch them. Those are people creatures. Use them for lobster bait, etc. Will all benefit. So I think, you know, most of you have probably seen Field of Dreams, where they say, where the story was, if you build the baseball field, they will come. Well, it's the opposite with alewives. If you knock it down, they will come back. And so we need to be working on removing obstacles and restoring the connections that we have with sea-run fish, that sea-run fish have with each other, and the creatures that depend on them. And really overall, this means reconnecting our lakes, our rivers, and our oceans, which really aren't disconnected. That disconnection exists in our minds, and unfortunately, we put it into place with concrete. So with that, I'm gonna let Abin show you all a video about the 20th anniversary of the Edwards Dam removal, and then I'll turn the talk over to Deb, who will discuss a very successful alewife restoration effort on Damariscotta Mills, at Damariscotta Mills. Thanks very much.
Let's see. Time for a switch over?
Yep, Deb, so you're up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Nick. That was a wonderful introduction. Unfortunately, at Damariscotta Mills, we were not able to take out a dam, but we had a fish ladder that was very old, 200 years old, in fact, and was in terrible shape. So our project was to rebuild or restore it. And this title gives you the sense, at least what it says, that we did that. I was the director of I have been and still am the director of the Damariscotta Mills Fish Ladder Restoration, but it was done with a lot of help from neighbors and friends. So it was a big community effort. Slide. I'd like to, let me just give you a little introduction to the place and why we probably couldn't take out a dam here, which I'm sure is the case in a number of spots. So this is the foot of Damariscotta Lake between Noblesboro, Newcastle, and Jefferson, Maine. And on the left-hand side of the screen, there's the original channel, or what was once the original channel. There's a small powerhouse where there is a hydroelectric project at the foot of a penstock and dam. On the right side of that area is the middle stream, where there's an overflow channel and there's a row of houses in a street, and the fish ladder runs along those houses. So that's the context of this. Next slide. So anywhere in Maine where there was sort of close to the coast and a good falls, back when Europeans first settled the area, there were mills built. And in Damariscotta Mills in 1730, a double sawmill was built. And by the time this photo was taken in 1883, the area was, all the outlets were dammed, and mills were located all along the outlets. Pretty different scene today, as you saw, but anyway, here we are looking at what it looked like in 1883. Slide. At that time, and even before, from the early 18th century, the fishery was an important part of what happened in Damariscotta Mills. Native Americans called the Damariscotta River Madamasconti, the place of little fishes, and we take that to mean alewives. So there was an alewife run on the Damariscotta during prehistory, and certainly it was a big part of what happened in Damariscotta Mills during the historic period. Here around 1900, you can see the a very big fish house, double the size of what it is today. And there were harvesting areas on both the original outlet of the stream and where there is harvesting today at the bottom of the middle stream. Slide. I like to show this slide from 1965. You can see back in those days, people weren't so careful about what happened with fish guts. And the fish house is still quite large, but everything was dumped overboard. So very active fishery at the time that supported many people in Damariscotta Mills. Men were harvesting, women were working in the fish house, cutting fish, packing them in salt and brine, and getting them shipped on the railroad to join ships, and they went all over the world. At that point, they were still food for human consumption. Slide. So in 1807, after a struggle of about 20 years in the late 1700s, the legislature of what was then Massachusetts, since Maine didn't become a state until 1820, there was a cry for a fish ladder because all the mills blocked and the dams blocked fish passage. Amazing that it was so early here in Damariscotta Mills, and we don't actually know what the earliest fish ladder looked like. But here we can see in the 30s that it was a series of pools with passages between them. It actually looks a lot like the pool and weir fishway that we reconstructed the fish ladder to look like in the last 10 years. Slide. An interesting part as you got to know the fish ladder when I first was involved in about 2005, 2006, was that many people through the years had tried their own ideas of how to fix different sections of the fish ladder. In those days, it followed the lay of the land. In other words, if the land was steep, the fish ladder was steep. If the land was flat, there was no rise. So that's something we changed with the new fish ladder, but I'll show you that in just a minute. Slide. Here is another section. By the time 2006 rolled around, there were sections of the fish ladder, this being one of them, that were being supported by 2x4s, probably not a very good way to support stone walls, but it was in really bad shape. Slide. Some of the reason it was in bad shape was because every winter, even though it was drained, freezing and thawing caused stones to fall into the channel. And here we're having a spring cleanup where people would go in before the water was turned back on and lift the stones out to open up the passage. But needless to say, the fish ladder was very narrow, confined, and the fish had a very tough time getting up in these years. Some of that had to do with a moratorium on harvesting that took place in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. There were very few fish at that time. One year there were only 38,000 fish counted. And with the moratorium on harvesting, people didn't tend the fish ladder as much as they did when harvesting was an impetus for that. So there was a lot more, the fish ladder just fell apart in much more intense way during that time. Slide. So I thought I'd introduce two characters that helped me personally get involved in the restoration. On the left is Frankie Walls. He's a longtime both harvester and he worked for the hydroelectric company. In those days, we had the same person in both roles, which was a real boon. He was able to show me the worst places in the fish ladder and also his magic of how to fix the fish ladder and get the fish up. And the one person on the right is George Weston, who turns 100 this month. Anyway, George's family had worked both in the hydro facility and on the fish ladder, and he's a local historian who also was instrumental in helping me to understand what was wrong with the fish ladder. Slide. So Frankie Walls showed us initially 5 different places that needed help desperately on the fish ladder, and this being one down by the footbridge near the bottom of the fish ladder, and what that vegetation is hiding is a collapsed wall. Slide. And here we've replaced the wall. I had to limit my slides, so I couldn't show you the excavator that sat on that rise behind the wall and excavated all the way down to water and then built it back up with drainage and stone. But this project took about 6 or 7 weeks and gave us a sense of just what would be involved in restoring this whole fish ladder. Right now, there are 69 pools, and the fish ladder rises, well, the actual total length of it is 1,500 feet, and it rises 42 feet. So it's a rather large structure. So a little bit intimidating, but we as a neighborhood had committed to doing it. Change the slide, please. So a group of us neighbors got together and thought we would fundraise to get our fish ladder fixed, it was very important to us that we do it as a neighborhood project, because so many people in this neighborhood, whether they'd grown up here or moved here from away, were really interested in seeing what was a very important structure fixed up and looking appropriate for our neighborhood. So this gang was the beginning of it, but ultimately we had several hundred volunteers that worked on the project. Slide. We raised in all, over a 10-year period, over $1 million. And about a third of that money was raised through festivals and community sponsored events. We had a soup festival in the fall and this big spring festival and several other events during the year. And we also wrote grants. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation was very generous to us, and as were a number of other organizations. Slide. We were also fortunate to have had some folks help us with a plan. So the fish ladder, as I mentioned earlier, had many different people had ideas of how to fix one pool or a few pools, but we never had an overall plan of how it would work. And Kurt Orvis from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Gail Whipplehauser from the Department of Marine Resources, and Ben Seavey from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the three of them came up with this plan for us, and we were so fortunate. This is for a pool and weir fishway. Each pool rises 10 inches and has about the same size circumference or volume of water. The weirs between pools are a standard shape, and overall this pool and weir fishway works beautifully. This is our plan. We didn't have anything more complicated than this, but we were able to apply the concept to the entire fish ladder. Slide. So just to give you a little overview, on the left, that is a map drawn by my husband, Mark Becker, of the fish ladder before we did any work. And on the right is the finished fish ladder. So you can see that on the right, we have a really nice standardized pools, and the fish ladder goes pool to pool. On the left, instead of rising an even 10 inches per pool, the fish ladder followed the lay of the land. It was steep where the land was steep. It was flat where the land was flat. And there were many places where the rise was too much for alewives, and it worked very poorly, even when it was in good repair. Slide. So we started on the top third, largely because it was the most accessible part of the fish ladder. And we figured that it would be easier to start where we could at least access the area. Again, this is before we did any work, and I think you can get a sense, it's a pretty messy structure at this point. Slide. A very interesting part of the whole process was that we were only allowed to work on the fish ladder from November 30th through April 15th. The rest of the year the fish ladder was open for fish passage. So not only were we challenged by rebuilding a very complicated structure, but we were limited to working in the winter. Slide. So by April 15th, we had to have finished pools. And here you can see the upper third. Things are looking pretty good. And almost immediately the changes, the alewives responded to the changes. We went from getting 80 to 100,000 fish in the fish ladder to about 300 to 500,000 within the first few years of our work. Slide. Here we're working on the middle third, and I think you can see looking down here, you're looking at a bridge abutment that we had to work through, and the access is much more difficult in this section. We had to work our way with an excavator down through the middle of the fish ladder. Slide. And here we had stopped trying to work with the original structure. It wouldn't have worked in this section because we had to get an excavator down through. So what you're looking at are the forms for concrete pools. And we decided that we would pour all the pools in concrete, slide, and then we would stone face them. So here you see the stone facing going on. And what was important about the stone, in one sense, was that we were retaining the historic character of the fish ladder. But more importantly, the face of the stones dissipate the energy of the water. So when water comes down through one of the weirs, it hits the stones and breaks up the energy of the water so that it's a much more natural flow. And it works so much better than a flat concrete wall. Slide. Finally, here we are laying out the lowest third of the fish ladder. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like to lay out pools, here we're laying them out with rubber, pieces of rubber to represent the pools and the sticks to represent the concrete. We had to figure out how to get the entire footings and walls in addition to the pools. Slide. And finally, again, work carried out in the winter underneath these tarps that often got covered in snow and collapsed. It was a real challenge. Slide. But in the end, after 10 years, we had an incredibly functional fish ladder, and we had gone from passing 80 to 100,000 fish to passing over 1 million fish. And as Nick said, the fish responded immediately. The minute we opened up this new fish ladder and gave them a series of pools that worked well, they responded and they just came. Slide. It was so exciting to see these neat pools and fish climbing pool to pool. This is a drone photo where you can see the layout of the pools looking from above, a little snow on the ground there. Slide. And this is a picture I took the other day. It was amazing to see how many fish now come back. You could literally walk on fish's backs across the water. They're so thick. We watched them come in from the bay in just huge boiling schools and come into the fish ladder. And where in the old days before our work, the oxygen used to get depleted in the lowest pools because there were so many fish and they would basically block the ladder. Now the fish just go right up through, and you can get a fish going from entry of the fish ladder to the top in half a day or less. Slide. And what's really wonderful is that so much wildlife has responded to the fish. I call them the mice of the sea. They are the bottom of the food chain, and whether it's osprey, eagles, seals come up the river and have come right into the fish ladder after the fish. So many different critters are flourishing because these fish have, the population has come back so well. And final slide. So now here's a ribbon of alewives coming in from the sea, and we are continuing our work. The local neighborhood had such a sense of success that nobody wanted to quit once the fish ladder was finished. So we're working on the walkways and have rebuilt this entire area with between the fish ladder and harvesting equipment. Anyway, it's been a great project, very successful. The fish are back, and I bet there's some questions. So thank you so much.
NIFWIF helped a small town renovate a fish ladder that rises alongside the local dam.
The Damariscotta Mills restoration project had all the key elements of success that we were looking for.
The Damariscotta Mills fish ladder is a 1,500-foot man-made structure with 69 pools or steps that rise 42 feet from the Damariscotta River to the Damariscotta Lake.
So the fish come in each spring, and we're all waiting for the fish. And one morning you show up, and they're here, and they're leaping pool to pool, and there's nothing more exciting. It is absolutely a magical moment.
Deb Wilson, a local resident, has helped lead the restoration effort for the past 8 years.
Before we started this project, if we were to have a good year, we would get anywhere from 80,000 to maybe 150,000 fish into the lake. Now last year we got over 1 million. This is an undertaking of a small community to restore quite a large fish ladder. So to have some serious help from NIFWIF really made all the difference. The river herring are coming back, and they are coming back in a big way.
And they're not the only ones coming back. The anticipation is over. The feast begins. Today, thousands of people from all over the world are coming to the Alewife Festival at Damariscotta Mills.
The community is huge. I mean, that's how we got the project done to this stage. It's all about community.
I think it's great. It's just fantastic to be able to see things coming back the way they should be.
They come to celebrate the unique relationship between people and nature. They come to witness the rise of the river herring.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Nick and Deb, for your wonderful presentations today. Folks, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you have a question for either Nick or Deb, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So Deb, this first question is for you. Comes from Rosie, and the question is, what percentage of incoming alewives actually end up in Damariscotta Lake? I know that you harvest a great number of them, so I'm wondering what the percentages that actually make it up to Damariscotta Lake.
I would say between 2/3 and 3/4. So if we pass 1 million fish, we may have harvested something like 300 to 350,000 fish.
That's great. And a related question, Lisa asks, how many people are coming every spring to see the alewife run?
Oh my goodness, thousands and thousands of people. I don't think we've ever counted them specifically, but a lot of people come. Literally thousands of people.
And is the fish ladder open to the public at this time of year right now?
It is. It was closed because of the virus until the end of May, but we were able to open it when the governor went from gatherings of 10 people to gatherings of 50 people. So people are welcome to come anytime. Wear a face mask and think of social distancing.
Great. So Nick, I'm going to pitch this question to you. The question is, could you better explain which metrics make up the total alewife potential for specific rivers? Can you speak to that, Nick?
Sure. That number is essentially based on available lake spawning habitat, and it's based on assumption of a couple of hundred fish per acre spawning. I think it's 235 or 240.
235.
Great. Deb, this question is for you, wondering about where your funding comes from for the ongoing maintenance of the fish ladder and the surrounding public access areas.
So a couple of places. Number one is from harvesting. All the money from the harvest goes into a dedicated fund to support the fish ladder and the facilities. And also we are creating a fund. So our continuous fundraising is creating an endowment so that we will be able to continue to take care of the fish ladder and facilities.
Great. Nick, this question is for you. It comes from Pete. who asked about how many alewives in total in Maine are now coming up to spawn in Maine's lakes. Are there any additional species in numbers which are also taking advantage of these dam removals and fish ladders?
So the biggest explosion of, or biggest increase of fish species has been among alewives and blueback herring. It's a little difficult to count between the two. So when you see those numbers that I showed earlier for the St. Croix, that is actually both blueback herring and alewives. You're starting to see in the Penobscot and the Kennebec that shad are coming back in numbers, which is really exciting because that is just such a great sport fishery. And we're definitely seeing shad come back. On the Kennebec, unfortunately, the fish lift at the first dam in Waterville does not work well, and shad are particularly hesitant to use it. It also works poorly for alewives and very poorly for Atlantic salmon. So about half of the shad habitat in the Kennebec watershed is above that first dam in Waterville. So the dam owner needs to do something about that dam and get fish above it. We've been working very hard for a long time on FERC and trying to get that situation remedied, and it's been very difficult. And in the future, we hope we can get the shad back up to that portion of the Kennebec, and the salmon, who actually on the Kennebec, salmon, the first really good salmon spawning habitat on the Kennebec is above, or is in Farmington in the Sandy River, and in the upper reaches of the Sandy River. So we need to get fish by 4 dams on the Kennebec, and so far we haven't been able to do that. If you really want to see huge numbers of shad and salmon again, we're going to have to improve the situation above Waterville.
Great. And just a follow-up question to that, Nick. Sarah Cotton asks, how can the public get involved in dam removal efforts here in Maine? How can the public get involved?
Well, it depends on the issue. In big situations that are big, like on the Penobscot or Kennebec, dams come up for relicensing, and that's a perfect time for the public to get involved, is in the relicensing process. Unfortunately, FERC licenses last sometimes 30 to 50 years, so you don't get all that many chances, that many bites at the apple. But there will be some licensing proceedings that are coming up with the opportunity for public comment on the Kennebec, and we will let our members know how they can get involved as we get to the points where it's important for the public to weigh in. For smaller dams, more local dams, you know, the best way is to just keep track of what your local watershed association is doing. They may be working on either dam removals or fishways like Deb has described, or helping fix up culverts. A lot of that stuff happens at the local level.
Great. Just a few more minutes for questions, folks. If you have a question for either Deb or Nick, please type it in the Q&A box. This next question is for you, Deb, from Steve Martin. No relation to me, I don't think. Steve asks, has restoration of sea-run fish and alewives affected the smallmouth bass population in the lake, in Damariscotta Lake?
No, it has not. There has been no issue with that.
Great. And another question for you, Deb. Ernie is wondering what the total cost over the 10-year period for constructing the fish ladder. What was that total cost, and where did the funds come from?
So basically, a round figure is $1 million. It was a little more than that. And the funds, about a third of them, came from public events that we put on as a group. The festivals, bean suppers, t-shirt sales. We often send 1 t-shirt at a time. 2/3 of that were from grants. And you know, writing every year end, we wrote a letter and asked people to donate, but largely from grants. And we had I was very busy. It was my second full-time job, was writing grants. So that's where it came from. And some from Harvard. and certainly from the towns.
That's excellent. So let's get one last question in here. And Nick, I'm going to pitch this question over to you. Where are some of the other efforts going on in Maine for fish restoration, either with dam removal or fish ladder construction? What are some of the other projects that are going on in Maine around the state to restore fish populations?
So I think one of the most fascinating projects is happening on the China Lake outlet stream. And that project is being led by Landis Hudson at Maine Rivers. And it's fascinating for a bunch of reasons. One is it's just a really good example of how much work it is to restore a fish run, because that's a small stream leaving China Lake, and it's got, I can't remember whether it's 6 or 7 dams, and Landis is working on removing several of them and putting fishways in at several others. And she's dealt with some really interesting characters in the course of this project. It's almost never, restoring sea run fish is also very much about people. And sometimes the people are friendly on the issue and sometimes they're not. And either way, there are always a lot of people who are really interesting, and some of them fun to deal with and some of them not so fun. And so Landis has some amazing stories and has really overcome a lot of obstacles to make that very complicated project happen. So that's one of my favorites. A couple of others that have happened recently are removal of a big chunk of the head tide dam on the Sheepscut and installation of a fishway at Branch Pond up in the northern part of the West Branch. Unfortunately, restarting the existing fishway at Sheepscut Lake has been one of those issues that's comparable to the St. Croix. And even though Sheepscut Lake is a great place for alewives to get up in and spawn, there's been a lot of resistance to allowing them in, although we have a fishway there ready to go for them to use. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has opposed reopening the fishway, and a lot of people around the lake has. So that in of itself is a story for another day, but it's a good example of how hard it can be to restore these fish to where they were for millennia before we messed things up.
Great. Well, thanks again to Deb and Nick for your wonderful presentations today. And thanks also to Abin, who's been running the slideshow in the background. Thank you, Abin. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Again, we would have loved to have been with you in person, but we appreciate you joining us on Zoom. Just a couple quick things before we sign off. This webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be available on YouTube in the coming days. You can learn lots more about fish restoration work and dam removal here in Maine at NRCM's website, nrcm.org. So definitely visit our website for more information. And you can learn more about the Damariscotta Fish Ladder Restoration Project at their website as well. So definitely visit our websites to find out more. And until next time, thanks for tuning in and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks for joining us.